the Second World War podcast with Stephen Bedard.
Welcome to the Second World War podcast, and I'm excited today to interview Rainey Horvath, who's going to talk to us about one of her new books. And Rainey, could you just share a little bit about who you are, and also want to welcome you to the show?
Hi, Steve. Thank you for inviting me on your show. My name is Rainey Horvath. I live in Westchester County, New York, and I am an author and a bit of an armchair historian, and kind of interested in military history. I'm not really sure why, but it may have to do with my father, who always told his amazing story of what happened to him in World War II. To make a long story short, after his death 2 years ago, I found a memoir he had written. And he had been sending memories since the 60s of his experiences. So it was the beginning of the pandemic. And here I was sitting at home with all these papers. And I decided to put them all together and make a book out of them. And so that's how this book came to be.
Wonderful. I'm so glad that you have done that, as it's sad that we are losing our veterans from the Second World War, and those voices that we had for so long are slowly slipping away from us. And it's because of people like you that we can continue to hear their stories. And so I'm really excited to hear about your father's experience. Now, in the podcast where we're at right now, we've been focusing a little bit on the conflict with the Germans, and then more recently with the Italians. We've talked a little bit about the Japanese, but not very much. So could you give us just a little bit of background, kind of situate us where in the war the story of your father takes place, and what we need to know to be able to understand his story?
I'd be happy to do that, Steve. Well, the Second World War truly was a world war. It was primarily fought in Europe, and that's what we, I guess, know the most about. But it was also fought in many other places in Africa. It played out in the Pacific, in the islands. And what was happening in China at the time, China was friendly with the US, and it had been having trouble with Japan for some time. Since the 1920s, Japan became an aggressor. It was interested in the natural resources in China. It attacked Manchuria. And so there were a lot of skirmishes and battles going on. But our focus was more, of course, on what was going on in the European theater and what we saw rising. However, in 1931, the Japanese bombed one of our river boats that was there on a friendly mission. It was not military. And we became involved, and we started looking at Japan more closely and worrying about them. We also saw that they were aggressively attacking China. And so Roosevelt became concerned about Japan and sent some of our people over there they sent Chennault over there to help the Chinese form their own air force and help them understand how to fight better. At the same time, the other war was going on, and Japan was becoming a problem. They joined the Axis, as we know, very interesting show about Italy and the Axis. And of course, although things escalated, we were still not really committed to Japan, although there was a lot of work going on between Chiang Kai-shek's wife and General Chennault and some of the other people that were involved over there. They did allow him to form a group of volunteer pilots who had left the US military, mostly retired, and go to China to help with the training of the Chinese Air Force. And they turned out to be very effective. And they started, while China was losing ground against the Japanese invaders, the Flying Tigers sort of turned the tide, and they were very much liked. So, of course, after Pearl Harbor, everything changed. And
So just to interrupt you for a moment there, just for clarification, the efforts of the Flying Tigers at that point there, this is before United States and Japan are officially at war. That is correct?
Yes, that is correct. The Flying Tigers went there after 37 when they bombed our riverboat. The Flying Tigers went in, I think 38 or 39. They started building up airfields, and so they were there. They were already there. The Flying Tigers had already been there, and they were in Kunming, and they had established quite a presence and a reputation. But they were not, at that time, they were sort of a renegade troop. We didn't until after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, we did not say that's the U.S. Air Force over there.
Mm-hmm.
So they were independent group.
Very good. Yes. So sorry, I continue on. The Pearl Harbor happened, and
Okay, so
everything
after
changed.
Pearl Harbor, everything changed immediately, and now Chenault and the people asking Roosevelt for money got it. Also, the Soviet Union contributed aircraft to the Chinese. It was an allied effort. Other allies have participated. Unfortunately, Britain was so overwhelmed with trying to fight its own war. They didn't have a lot of funds to spare, but they did supply troops. Australia was there. Many of our allies were there. And so at that time, they formed the U.S. Army Air Corps and decided that we would go and help China. We made a pact, and the deal was we would supply the money and the men to train their army. There was a nationalist army run by Chiang Kai-shek, and the people would build the airfields because there were very few airfields in China at the time, and so that's how it played out. Immediately, I think within 2 weeks, Chiang Kai-shek had assembled several million workers who built the airfields by hand. And at the same time, they opened up they said we need more pilots. They realized they didn't have enough pilots. And so they started training American pilots or taking American pilots that were already in training and increasing the numbers of them. And my dad was among some of the first pilots they sent to China.
Mm. What year would that be?
He thought he would be going to Europe for sure. He knew he wasn't going to be a B-29 bomber pilot because he learned that in training, but he thought he would be in Europe. And at the last minute, he found out he was going to China.
Mm. What year was that?
That would be 1943.
Okay. Yeah. So he sent there, and was that a little bit of a surprise that he was going to that particular area then?
Yeah, he said he had always been interested in China as a little boy. It's of course very exotic and very far away. As a little boy, I think his mother had a stereoscopic viewer, and he looked at some stereoscopes of China, and I think they had a book he read about the world, and he read about China, and he was fascinated with it. He thought it'd be an interesting place to go. But of course, all of our pilots in the Second World War were very well trained, but they weren't ready for what they met in China, because of the flying conditions. So the route he flew was pretty much from Kunming into India to bring supplies in over while the Lido Road was closed. And it was probably one of the most dangerous air routes in the world. And aviation was in its infancy then, military aviation. So I don't think he was quite ready for what he got.
So the danger wouldn't be just the Japanese, but the terrain and the weather and everything else as well.
Oh, there were many problems. Our sort of state of our military aviation at the time was really in its infancy, and their maps were inadequate. There was hardly radar. There was gasoline shortages that really were a problem. You only got enough gas to get somewhere and back, assuming there were no delays, and there were always delays. And the weather was unbelievable. 200-mile-an-hour winds, headwinds. The Himalayan mountains create their own weather pattern, and it was totally unpredictable. And they didn't have anything we have now, none of our sophisticated equipment. So it's kind of amazing that any of them survived, really.
It is incredible. It is. So what kind of missions was he flying?
When he first got there, he went over there as what was called a pilot observer, and he was with the 19th Liaison Squadron, they were smaller planes. They were Stinson L5s, which are a smaller, think of a bush pilot in Alaska. And so they would be flying behind enemy lines, and they would either be taking personnel there or equipment, mail, picking people up, picking up injured passengers. He crashed into a mountain and survived, but broke his back. And while he was recovering, he decided he wanted to fly bigger planes and do more. I guess many of us would just want to get out of there, but he wanted more. So he then transferred to the 27th Troop Carrier Squadron, which he was part of the 14th Air Force, and he was stationed in, all over in different places. And then he began flying large C-47s, several different models. And then they were transporting like 6,000 pounds of cargo. It might be barrels of cement. It might be troops and cannons. It might be Chinese soldiers. It might be one time they had to fly like donkeys and horses somewhere because that's how people got around then. So he never knew. He just, they would land the plane and then the loaders would load the plane and they would take off and get the equipment there.
I think it's important to take a moment just to realize how important these kinds of missions were, that people get a sense, I think, from watching movies that it's all about dogfights. It's all about trying to shoot down as many enemy planes as possible. But to keep a defense going and to continue a war effort, it requires a tremendous amount of equipment and supplies. And all of those missions were just vital for keeping things going. And I really think that people don't realize how much of that really needed to happen.
Absolutely, Steve. And we saw that recently in Afghanistan when one of our modern transport planes flew, 600 or 700 souls out of Afghanistan. And we saw the pictures of these gigantic cargo bays. But when you're in one of these remote situations, China certainly was a landlocked country, and it was very far from us. It took a really long time to get there on a boat, and so getting supplies back and forth was really critical. And they needed everything. They needed food, they needed gasoline, they needed bullets, they needed bandages. So yeah, nothing can happen if you don't have the proper supplies.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not glamorous. It is not like being a bomber pilot, certainly. But it's certainly a necessity.
Mm-hmm. And how did things work out for him with that stage of his military service?
He seems, when you read what he wrote, he was a young man and he was exhilarated by it. I think he recognized the danger. He was often in danger. He crashed twice. They never knew. He said the most frightened he ever was, he would get in air raids and there would be like bullets coming at him and stuff. And that was pretty scary, but he managed to keep his cool and he seemed to really enjoy it, to be honest with you, as much as one can enjoy something like that. Although I'm sure it is very exciting for a young person to be in those situations. When he was flying the larger transport planes over the hump, he was very serious about his work. They loved their planes. He loved them. And they named them and they were very important to them. It's what kept them alive. And he talks about how clean they kept their planes. Pilots wouldn't fly a plane if there was like dirt in the back or anything. They had to be kept spotless and kept in ship shape because you were on your own out there. So he very much, I don't want to say he enjoyed his time, but he certainly got every inch of excitement out of it that he could.
So your book is called Able Queen.
The Able Queen, yeah.
Yes, and I just wanted to mention that it's in the subtitle, it refers to him as a hump pilot from Indiana, and I'm not sure if everyone here who listens to my podcast is familiar with that term, hump pilot. So could you just explain that for a moment?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, a hump pilot was the name that was given to these special kind of transport pilots in China that flew this route. It was from Assam, India to Kunming, China. And you had to get there, you had to fly over the highest part of the Himalayan mountains. It was a 535-mile stretch, which doesn't sound long, but it was very long. When you didn't have adequate maps and your gas was low and people were shooting at you and you were in 200-mile-an-hour headwinds. They just called the Himalayas the hump. That's just what they called it. So it was kind of a nickname that stuck.
Okay. Now, in going through your father's memoirs, was there anything that surprised you or something that you learned about him that you had no idea?
There were many things that surprised me, Steve. And in fact, these stories that I had heard since I was a little kid, I always thought maybe he embellished it. But when I began to research what he had left behind, he did not. In fact, if anything, he underplayed the dangers. One thing that surprised me was he always talked about how afraid the pilots were to crash because there were headhunters and cannibals that ate people. And we just laughed about that when we were kids and said, oh yes, you're dead. Sure, there were headhunters. And then I found out there really were. And they were called they were a tribal people, the Lolos. And they actually had immigrated into the mountains of China from Laos many years before. They did not even speak Chinese or understand Chinese. They spoke their own tribal language. And our allies, the British, who had been there before we were, did in fact were captured by them and never heard from again. It was frightening because they thought that when a pilot, let's say, bailed out and landed from the sky, that it was a gift from God and that the workers were sent there to help them. And they often captured them and kept them as slaves and killed some. I don't have any personal knowledge of them actually eating anyone, but reputation starts somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So that surprised me very much.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that would be terrifying. Just having that in the back of your mind that when you are crashing, it's not like, say, in the Battle of Britain when you're a British pilot gets shot down over England, that they can just come down on their parachutes and land in friendly territory and just get back into a plane again. It's going to be a lot different when you're flying missions like your father was.
Yes, sadly, there were 345 Hump pilots who crashed and were never heard from again.
Wow.
They didn't find the bodies. They just disappeared.
Mhm.
Some we know were actually captured by the Japanese and put into prison camps. Some we just don't know. They just
Mhm.
disappeared.
Mhm. Well, it sounds like a fascinating book. What is it that you hope your readers will get out of the book? What's the sort of the bottom line that you're hoping that they'll receive?
Well, I think it's important for people to understand what our troops go through, what our pilots go through, and the where my father was in China is called the CBI Theater of War. It was one of the many theaters of war. I think so. I guess if anything, it would be spreading the word about our huge war effort and our huge cost of human life in China during the Second World War, in probably the least known theater of the war. I think it deserves to be heard. There are a lot of amazing military and miraculous battle stories that came out of there.
Yeah, it's interesting that people are unaware. Sometimes I wonder if some of our strained relationships we've had with China, between the West and China, have had something to do with that. That we underemphasize the ways that we supported China during the Second World War. But I'm glad that you've written this book to help rectify that.
Well, thank you, Steve. And really, it's my father that wrote the book. There are publishing rules and copyright rules, and once someone is dead, you can't publish a book in their name. So I had to add some material to it in the front and back. I also have a couple of wonderful experts on the CBI theater. Carl Wiedenmeyer is Wiedenberner. Let's see, what's his name? Carl Wiedenberner is one, and he is just fantastic. So yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I hope that everyone will get a copy of Able Queen, and they can get that, I'm assuming, online at Amazon or any
is
major.
always good.
Yes. And where can people find you online?
www.rainyhorvath.com. It's just my name. So,
well, I'd encourage people to find you online and to see some of the other projects that you've been working on. I was checking out your website, and you've got some interesting things there that you've written on. So that's very
well,
good.
thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. I know my dad would be proud.
Well, I'm glad that you've done this, and I'm sure that he would be very happy that you have shared his story, and hopefully this message will go on to many, many people. Thank you for being
so
a part of
much.
this.
It's
And
my pleasure.
yes, it's been wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you.
Listen to the podcast at anchor.fm/Second World War or on your favorite podcatcher. And find more resources, including blog posts, at stephenjbedard.com/Second World War.